Everybody in the United States should have the protection of their rights under the law, and this includes police officers. There are situations where, because of certain circumstances, police officers who are doing their duty become the victims of wrongful lawsuits or wrongful prosecutions. And it's important that we as citizens back up those officers and to make sure that they are not financially bankrupted or even perhaps wrongfully convicted. And that's why the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund is so important.
Ever since I was a little girl, all I ever wanted to do was be a police officer. I wanted to marry my love of law enforcement and my love of animals, particularly dogs. In September of 1995, I was a new canine handler and I was riding with my training officer, and we were called to the scene of a nighttime commercial breaking and entering in progress. I ended up making 2 arrests with the use of my dog. Those arrests were by-the-book arrests. They were according to my training and my education and my standard operating procedures. I completed all the reports and paperwork that went up the chain of command pertaining to this arrest, and there were no questions. Everything was done properly. 5 years later, unbeknownst to me, and much to my surprise, the Department of Justice ended up filing charges against 3 officers, myself, my training officer, and the arresting officer, for deprivation of civil rights under color of law and conspiracy to commit that act. I know what happened that night, and I know how I carried myself, and I know exactly what action I took and why I took it. And to be indicted for a crime for doing your job, it was almost unbelievable.
Law enforcement officers routinely respond to dangerous and rapidly evolving situations. And when they respond to these, sometimes they have to use force. Occasionally they use deadly force. And when they do that, sometimes even when they follow the book to the T and do everything the way they're supposed to, they're prosecuted. What we do at the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund is we identify cases where the officer acted lawfully and within their training, and yet, even though they've done that, they're still being prosecuted. We provide funding to aid in their defense. We pay for attorney's fees, we pay for expert witness fees, jury consultation. Sometimes we're even able to pay some funds to help support the officer's family while they're going through this.
I just didn't know what my future held. I didn't know whether I would be able to keep my job. I didn't know whether I would be able to keep my freedom. I didn't know whether my family would remain intact. My first thoughts were always of my son, Adam. He was 2 years old at the time I was indicted and while I was going through my trials, and all I could think of was him. If I was to be convicted, what would happen to him? What would happen to us? Would he know me? Would he know that I was his mom and that I never meant to leave him? It was emotionally challenging, it was physically challenging, it was financially challenging. I pled not guilty at both trials, and I testified on my own behalf, and I made a conscious decision to do that as opposed to entertaining any pleas the government might have offered. And I did that because I knew I had done nothing wrong. We had 2 trials. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and so because it was a hung jury, the government was able to retry us. I was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. I knew I needed to appeal for justice. I wasn't guilty. I didn't do what they said I did. And I couldn't afford to fund my appeal myself. It would have bankrupted me and bankrupted my extended family. So I had to reach out for help. And that's how I came to know the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund.
The services that the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund provides are largely financial for the police officer, helping him pay for the legal defense, and moral support. We raise money from a list of very dedicated donors across the country, and we use those funds to pay for legal fees, for expert witnesses, for other technical support in the trial. We have supported the officer. He often gets laid off, doesn't have a job, doesn't have any income, and we can help him there financially. But then we also provide moral support so that they know that there's somebody else there when they are oftentimes pretty lonely.
I've had the privilege of being involved in law enforcement in various capacities for over 50 years, and I've seen situations where police officers who are doing their duty are wrongfully prosecuted or wrongfully sued, sometimes as a result of politics, sometimes when people have a vendetta against the officers. And that's why I think Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund is so important, to provide the support that officers need when they come wrongfully under these kind of conditions.
I went to prison in March of 2003. The Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund not only provided me with a legal defense, but they provided me with support and resources that were critical and crucial to me during my appeals and during my incarceration.
The mission of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund is both charitable and educational. We provide funds to support officers who have been wrongfully charged with crimes in connection with their duties, but also we provide education. So we aim to educate the public, usually through the media, on the challenges that law enforcement officers face in their duties. Sometimes we do so by giving public presentations, but oftentimes we do so by using our use of force simulator and bring members of the public and members of the media, elected officials and others in to experience firsthand what it's like for officers responding to dangerous situations.
Well, driven to police work was, I saw it as a way of not only to support myself and get experience in the law enforcement field, but it was also a way of serving my community and doing something, having a job that really means something. September 12th, 2006, myself and several other officers responded to a hit and run case. During the investigation, we found that there was an individual who was in some apartments nearby who had assaulted a police officer who was known to be armed, and he was also a suspect in a armed robbery and shooting. We went to find the subject. Myself and another officer were in the rear of the building. It was extremely dark. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. We could hardly see more than 1 or 2 feet in front of our faces there. And the subject violently came out the rear. The other officer fired his weapon. We both believed that he was armed. I also was forced to use deadly force because he was presenting himself as a threat. Subsequently, almost 2 years afterwards, a special grand jury was convened and eventually a criminal grand jury, and I was indicted for murder, voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, and violation of oath of office. Thankfully, I was able to get the support of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund to help me pay for my defense, which otherwise would have put me in financial ruin. And there was even the possibility of serving a life sentence in jail.
Another former DeKalb County police officer is talking to Channel 2 tonight. It's after prosecutors decided to drop a murder charge he was facing.
Surrounded by his parents and the attorneys who stood by him, Torrey Thompson says he feels like he has his life back. Thompson says he's considering going to law school and hasn't ruled out a return to law enforcement.
The case, the county where this occurred, was under some other scrutiny for the use of force over time, and Torrey Thompson was ultimately judged not by his own actions, but by the sentiment in the county at the time. That's not an uncommon occurrence.
The cop is usually the lowest guy on the totem pole. And so if there is a big controversy, and these cases are usually very controversial, and so it falls to the cop on the beat. And so he may get he may get indicted, and there is a trial, and that's where we come to his defense.
Cases where officers are being wrongfully sued or wrongfully prosecuted are brought to us sometimes by police officer organizations, sometimes by private citizens, sometimes by the families of police officers. we immediately investigate the situation, we get the facts, and then we carefully review those facts, and every case in which we support a police officer under these circumstances is carefully reviewed by our board of directors, so that there's multiple ways in which we ascertain that the contributions of the citizens who support Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund are properly being used.
The Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund not only provided me with a legal defense, but they provided me with support and resources that were critical and crucial to me during my appeals and during my incarceration.
If I hadn't found out about the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, I would be in financial ruin. I would possibly be incarcerated.
I support the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, and they're really proud to be part of this organization. It's the only way that we have as citizens to really show our support for officers who are doing their duty and for whatever reason are being wrongfully involved in legal actions. They have put their lives on the line for us. It's important that we as citizens protect them when they're in the right.